So,
This conference will now be recorded.
so I've gotten a bunch of really good comments, particularly from NVIDIA on this. So I'm really grateful for that. So I think the document is in pretty good shape, except for probably one high order bit that we probably need to talk about. There's a bunch of comments about supporting I3C, and we talked about this a couple of times. I spent maybe 2 or 3 hours last week looking at it. I3C is much more complicated than I2C and SM bus. So the question I would have is for this type of interface, do we want to support that? And then the second question for you, Nate, and or for the other steering committee members is, do we want to hold this document up to add I3C to it, or do we want to move it forward and then do a revision for I3C? So I think I'd probably like to start with that discussion first, Nate. Does anyone have specific thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think we should include I3C in the doc. Um,
Sorry,
we've
Nate,
gone around.
I broke up on my side. You think we should?
Yes, I think we should keep it in the doc
Okay.
because
It's
if
not
we
in there right
never,
now, right? So just to be clear, it's written around SM bus and I2C today. So that's now the command set could easily be mapped onto to I3C. I don't think there's any question that that's straightforward to do. But there's a I3C has a bunch of optional slash required features around the common command and a bunch of other pieces that we would have to parse through and get an agreement as to what is the minimal set of these commands that we'd want to support in this type of interface. And again, the goal for this whole thing was to make it easy to implement uh, in a ROM slash hardware ish type of thing. So I have no problem pushing that. The question is that that's going to take probably a couple of revisions, and I would, since there's not a lot of information on I3C devices in the wild, we would need to put some dedicated work into this. That would probably take a couple of months to complete, I would think. So we just need to keep that in mind.
all right, so I know we've been pushing for I3C uh, in other ways already.
Correct.
So
Yep.
it would be, consistent to also put it in here. Um,
hmm
but it could be a later
Again,
revision.
I don't. I mean, I think this doc has been open for a while, and my personal opinion is I would like to get the SM bus stuff moving so that we could get devices thinking about how to implement that. That would be that would be my recommendation. But I mean, if there's anyone else on the call that has specific, timelines or needs to push I3C, we can do that. It's just I thought it was going to be simple, but it's not. It's a much more complicated protocol than which is obvious. And then there's also kind of this, and it's this dichotomy between the basic command set and the I'll call it the MIPI advanced, and there's some licensing information around that I haven't gotten to the bottom of. The basic looks like it can be implemented without any licensing, but the advanced, you need to be a MIPI member of some type, I think, is what it's the way it's done. So I think we're using, but again, the way that the specs are written, it's definitely difficult to parse apart.
All right, the thing I'd like to avoid is if implementing this in I squared C and SM bus means it delays people implementing it in I3C
Right.
later.
Okay, that's a valid concern.
Actually, picking up on that, that could be a serious concern if the issue of conformance comes up and you don't have the newer technology, which looks like it's being embraced in other quarters.
The issue I have with I3C is that there's no, I mean, it hasn't been approved by any standards bodies for being used, right? I mean, there are some stuff in the chem spec today, not today, that is in progress, but nothing. I mean, we can't go pick any kind of open format and say that I3C is either required, optional, or for this interface. So it's not. I'm not against this at all. I'm just again trying to. This doc has been open for a while, and I want to get it to a point where people can start implementing it. Because I think it's one of the tenets that we're trying to push is being able to recover a device to a known state. And again, this should be rare. I think the whole point of this is that this should be a rare event. So the question is adding I3C worth the complications on this interface if it's a rare event to do this recovery? And again, that's just something we need to talk about.
I think the main technical advantage of supporting I3C recovery is that the recovery controller has to be always available. And if the I2C and I3C controllers are sharing the same physical bus interface, then that limits the speed of the I3C controller.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the whole point or one of the points of moving to I3C was speed.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously.
Images are getting too big. It'll take like half an hour to push an image over IC, and
But it's
PRC and like all kinds of issues.
It's not a huge drop in performance because the main thing would be is you're using the I3C interface for your full-fledged firmware update and attestation, and having hardware do recovery over I2C won't make that not happen. So for your big bucket stuff, you're still using a higher speed out of band interface, even with the same wires. It's just that the maximum performance could be limited, and your recovery itself will be slower.
So I think what you're stating is that if you had an I2C internal recovery agent that shared the same bus logically with your main agent, that's the concern?
That's right.
Okay.
If you're sharing the same two wires effectively.
Right. Which is what we would want to do for sure. Again, if the group wants to do this, I'm totally on board. Really, the question is timeline, because I do think it'll take some time to get this in there.
I don't know how you can require it. You could put it in, optionally at best, but we are pushing it to get adopted in under standards, but it's not there yet. So you want to publish the specification, this year or in 2 years' time. That's really the question.
It's like for how long? It's kind of like, it seems like, I mean, if this document has been unless it's everything to be reworked. I mean, if we can add I3C later as an extension, then let's get it out, and not like have some kind of late requirement. I mean, someone could have brought this up 6 months ago, but now it's like almost ready to be published, and you're bringing up a new requirement. It's like
right. We talked about this in the I'm going to say August time period, and we decided to do it in a revision. And the only reason I'm bringing it up is there was at least 2 or 3 comments in here that was around I3C. So I think what I would propose is we move forward with SM Bus, and I think we should have a dedicated review if there's a couple of, I mean, I've read all the docs on I3C, but I'm not going to pretend to be an expert. So if we wanted to have a dedicated set of review to make sure that there's nothing in the current specification that would preclude adopting I3C, I think that would be good. But after that, I would move it forward with the SM Bus implementation.
Why don't we have if we don't already have a roadmap that we're publishing, put it on a roadmap, let people know what direction we're headed, but
okay.
Don't, it doesn't make sense to put a speculative compliance requirement in this thing. Okay. People can't do anything about it.
Yeah, I think we all agree that we've been working on this for a lot of time now. We should get this done, published,
Right.
and work on I3C extensions when the time comes.
Perfect. So I think we should add this as a roadmap item. And I've looked at it, and I think the command set can be implemented via I3C. There was a couple of comments around the topology would have to be different, and I added a statement and around that in the doc. If you look at SMBus has by definition this command byte, and that's how the demultiplexing of these things happen. Well, it was pointed out, which is obvious, which is true, is that command byte is not in I3C. So what you would need to do is have a dedicated interface. So it would look like two logical controllers in the device. So I added, essentially a section or a couple sentences said that this is the preferred implementation. So I think with those kind of statements and guiding people to move that direction, I think we should move forward with it. Okay, that's good. So
Sounds
let me,
good. Yeah.
All right, perfect. So there's a couple of comments. Is there anything we want to discuss about symbiont devices in this? There's a couple of comments. I looked at it. This really came from the original doc. I'm not sure if there's anything here that we want to discuss on this. Is there any way we want to change this? So if that's true, I'm going to leave the text as is, and I'm going to just resolve this comment because I think it's true.
I think it would be good to just not use that term just in case it causes confusion with 193, because I don't think the usage here is what 193 intended for that term.
Perfect. I love it. Okay. Okay, awesome. All right, so this is good. I'll fix that. The other piece that I think the other piece is there is some discussion around the validation of the image. And Jeff, if you're on, depending upon when you joined, we went around on this, and there was originally some discussion about should you validate the image before it's activated effectively in this language. And I think what we basically stated, the resolution of that was that if you can download the image, and as long as you can avoid time to check, time to use attack, you can activate the image and then allow the secure boot process to effectively validate the image, assuming that there is boot codes that would allow you to debug what happened. And that's where we ended up with this. So if you look at the way it happens, you can basically download an image and then activate it, and the secure boot process will validate it. And if there's problems with the image, it will update the secure boot, the error code with the correct error code based upon if there was any errors in booting that image. So that's the way it's written right now. I think it resolves all of the issues. So any comments on this? Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'll resolve that one. Okay, so there was a couple discussions with some folks on the line about image activation, and there was a desire not to have to go through a device reset. Okay, so what I did is I said, okay, that's fine. So what they wanted to be able to do was to essentially activate an image, and that's fine. So what's in the spec right now? I updated the picture a little bit to add it a little bit. The firmware activation is a specific command that's in the recovery, and that activation process must effectively bring you back to a mutable hardware trust anchor. Is where it's written right now. So you can either go through a reset process, So if you want to reset, that's fine. If you want to load the image, close the window, and then vector to the start of your ROM or whatever piece. As long as you can make sure that that device ends up, that process ends up in the original trust anchor of your secure boot process, it's acceptable. So is there any comments on that? Is that relatively clear as to what the requirement was and why the change was made?
I'm puzzled at how you can get to a secure state, a guaranteed secure state without resetting it.
Yeah, I think another way of putting that is that you have to be able to explain how that puts you in a known trusted state. However you achieve it, you've got to be able to explain that. And then there's a question of just IP protection and all that. Are all vendors going to be comfortable with that, or what standard do we hold manufacturers to as far as explaining their root of trust, why it's trusted?
And to give an example, it would be, let's say a flow for a immutable mask ROM to start a secure boot process would be fetching code from Flash, authenticating it, and then jumping it to the initial vector. Here, one implementation would be you're fetching code instead of from Flash, but from a recovery interface, and then authenticating and jumping to it. In contrast, another approach would be you fetch from a recovery interface, store in a RAM that doesn't reset, and then reset the device so that it boots from that RAM instead of the Flash interface. The only difference being is what is the mask ROM doing in terms of fetching the code, but the remainder of the steps of the secure boot process would remain the same. So that's where enforcing a reset seems too much of an implementation detail. The rest of the flow can be architected, and the reset itself can introduce different hazards because now you have to build these non-resettable RAMs.
So you'd still have to go through the secure boot logic.
Yep.
That's not clear from here, but
So I put it in, it's in here. Where is it? This is where I put it. If anyone would like to suggest some additional, must ensure the device restarts into the device immutable trust anchor. That's the way I put it. Is there a better language to put here? But this is why, this is where I.
you put a comment like also known as secure boot or something.
Okay.
I don't know. Probably use that everywhere.
Okay, I'll add something in here that specifically calls out secure boot.
Okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
So maybe I'm misunderstanding something. In the previous discussion, just 5 minutes ago, I thought we said that it was okay to not check the integrity of the image because it was going to be checked by the boot process.
Correct.
Right?
Yep.
So that is, in this case, then there's a problem, right? So you have to make sure that you're not doing, I'm not checking the image and I'm not booting, right? You see what
So I do see what you mean. That's not the intention, so we need to figure out how to wordsmith this a little bit better. The intention, I believe, so I think what Rune is talking about is not forcing the device to reset. You can effectively enter your trust anchor, programmatically if you want to, which is I think what is what's being asked for. So what we need to make sure this says is that when you activate, you must start in the trust anchor of the secure boot process. That's what it needs to say, and I think that's the requirement. Is that clear?
Yeah, I think that's a lot
Yeah.
better way to say it. That's clear.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'll wordsmith this a little bit and add some piece. Varun, is that what you or Elaine?
Yeah, I have kind of a related question though, which is what assures that the state of the device has been essentially wiped, your registers and everything else that that does the immutable trust anchor guarantee that all that's clear? Or normally in a reset, all that would get wiped, right?
Right. Agreed. So
I think for an implementation, you have to choose whether you want to do the reset before um, loading the recovery image or after. But I agree that the reset should be there. To me, I think it makes more sense to do it before because you want to be in a state where the recovery interface itself may not have been denied service by any mutable code that's left in the device. For example, if there's mutable code that's still managing the I2C interface, it could cause dropping of bytes or changing the address in a way that prevents the recovery agent from pushing bytes to the recovery controller. And so you start with a reset, use the recovery interface to load the bytes of the recovery image, and then activate the recovery image. And then you could choose to implement that activation via another reset, which has its own pros and cons, or with a state transition in your controller.
well said. That's exactly perfect. So Elaine, does that
Oh, yeah, I'm talking on mute. That's really clear, and I like that. Is that what the picture showed, the one that you just showed us a minute ago?
I think
Or
so,
attempted
but I'll let everyone else think that. What may not be clear is, so I think what we need to add someplace is that you must go through at least one reset.
Yes.
And I think that's probably not clear from, I think you can apply it, but I think we should explicitly state it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll do that. And Varun, you've been good on comments. If you could just take a look at it, and I think we can resolve that.
Sounds good.
Perfect. All right. I think there was another kind of comment in here. So this one was around invalid commands, and I think invalid in this context would be commands that are not defined. So the way it's written right now is an invalid command is nact, and I think the question is that should we just should we not define that and allow it to be implementation specific? What I did here to kind of resolve this is I left this and I added a command at the end that's vendor defined. So Varun, so do you think this is an acceptable resolution to this comment?
I think I'm asking a different question. Say, for
Okay.
example, a device didn't implement the reset command, device reset command, but the recovery agent issued that command. What should the response be?
Okay, that's a good question. In this case, it would have to be NACT. That's not great. So basically, the point is that if you basically do a command reset or any kind of optional, what is the behavior? What is the required behavior?
Correct.
Okay. So the way this is written right now is that would be an invalid command and it would be NACT. The question is that do we want to? Is that the right behavior?
In this case, invalid means, or in the comment, the invalid means unsupported.
Yes. it would be invalid and unsupported commands. So I mean, as an example, if you go down and you can see, this, like for example, this reset, not the status, yeah. So if it's yeah, so this is not required. So if I send this command, what's the behavior? And I think as written, this would be nacked. And the question is that really what we want to do? I'm not sure.
Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you knack?
Do we have the? Do you have in the list the list of possible responses?
So really, the only error condition is the knack right now. Like, so I mean, if these are all read write, so so if you, sorry for moving around. So if that's for example, if you wrote to this register and it's not supported, okay, the way this is written right now is we'd knack that. The other way to go is you could just, silently accept it, and not cause an error, not cause a knack on the bus. That's a good question.
Yeah. Very, very generically, you usually want to distinguish between an error, like a not supported, and an error, right?
Right, exactly. So this is unsupported, right? So in this case, the device presumably properly advertised the capability that it doesn't support this, and the controller did it anyways. So the question is, in that case, what is the... So I think probably the thing to do is to each of these cases where it's not required is to basically define a behavior. And it may be do nothing, or it may be set an error in one of the status registers. Let me take an action to look at this, but I think that's the right behavior to look at it. Is that if there's a case where you get an error in any of these cases that's not supported, probably the right thing to do is to set a bit in the status and then just accept the command. Is probably the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think the most important question is if that controller is counting on that command being executed. For example, because the reset is going to cause images to be reevaluated, right, or
right,
or re-verified. In that case, the controller needs to know if the reset didn't happen.
Well, it would get, so in this particular example, it could get that from the status.
Yeah, all I was saying is that maybe the silent behavior is not the right thing, right? There has to be a way for the controller to figure out that the command didn't work.
So let me make sure that my definition of silent is clear. What I mean by this is that if you wrote this, you don't error the bus and knack it. You accept the command and then would update the error register in the device status and say unsupported command or something here.
Yeah, that would be fine. And then anybody writing a controller should check that bit after they do the reset.
Correct.
Yes, that would work.
Okay. All right. So I think what I will do is I will walk through these, anything that's not required, and I will, put specific language on what you're supposed to do in these cases. That'll be relatively straightforward to do. But the other case is that if you give us a command that is not that we don't understand, I think we should leave the behavior as in we knack it, or we could change that as well. I'm not really. I don't have a strong opinion either way on it, to be honest with you. So right, so if we go back to that, if I could find it again, it's probably, yeah. So this case so I think there's two pieces that need to be expanded here. The invalid case is one that's not defined in the command set, and then the other one is unsupported. So I think the invalid should stay the same unless someone has strong opinions otherwise. And I will add a specific statement on unsupported. Okay. Is that acceptable?
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks.
Perfect. All right. So there was a couple comments on the default address if you're using I2C and not ARP. So there's two possible resolutions of this. We talked about this a little bit. We could insist that ARP is used, which I don't have a problem with. I think most implementations support ARP today. Or, you use the default address of D2. There was a couple of questions about whether this is a good address. I think that this is fine. If there's anyone has any reasons why this can't be used, then we can change it. So I guess the first thing is, should ARP be mandatory? Do we have a anyone have a comment on that? So I think we should leave it unless someone has strong opinions as to why we need to use ARP. Okay. Okay, we made it it's a should right now. And is there anyone have an issue with this as the default address? If there is, send me an email offline or add a comment and we can resolve it. But I didn't, in the specs that I looked at, I didn't see, this was all in a reserve space. I didn't see any specific. All right. Okay. I'll leave that until I close it. This is the I3C piece, and I think I did add in here that this is the preferred topology, which is this one. And in this case, if this was I3C, you would have to have essentially two different logical addresses and endpoints. Is I think the point that Varun made in this in the comments, which is absolutely true given my reading of this piece. Okay. Let's see here. I think the only other comment was this one, which I think is a good question. So the question is that, okay, the device detects that there's a problem and it boots into it boots the ROM into recovery mode, okay, which is 100% part of the spec. So the question is that in this case, does the boot failure is that effectively the last boot in this case, because we essentially entered recovery via this mechanism? And I think the answer is yes. I think this should, in the case that you're in recovery mode, this should reflect the last boot status. So I think that's what I was thinking. That's what I think is a good resolution. Varun, do you have any other comments on this?
I agree too, but to be sure, can we make that statement generically that first step would be whenever you're in recovery mode, the boot failure code reports the status of the prior boot, which the device was forced into recovery mode. That status may in fact be healthy.
Right. Yep. I'll do that. Does anyone have any issues on that? I think that makes the most sense.
Yeah. The other thing would be is that this device status could be queried while the device is not in recovery mode.
Yes.
And so in that case, should it also still report the code of the last boot? I think the way that perhaps if we look at it from the reverse angle of how to implement this, you would have some register state that gets programmed as part of the device's boot process. And if the
Right.
device and that register state would be sticky across the normal to recovery mode transitions.
Yep,
And so
agreed.
it'd be queried there. And so naturally it'd always fall of the last boot process that happened, whether
Right.
that was before the recovery mode reset or within.
Yep, I think that makes sense to me. So I will, I'll add some language around that as well. Okay.
Why aren't you just getting them on the failed boots? Why do you have to keep dragging them along into recovery?
So the point of this is that if you're in if you're healthy, so let's run through a scenario. Okay, so the device fails to boot, and let's just pick a code that we basically failed to authenticate the key manifest. This one right here, just to pick someplace. Okay, so now the device has two options. A, it can just sit there and do nothing, or B, which is part of this spec, is that I can enter recovery mode, which means updating the recovery status to say that I'm in recovery mode, which is via, sorry again, I'm gonna try to make sure I don't get people sick, which would be this status here. I'm in recovery mode, ready to accept the image. Okay, so now if that was caused an internal logical reboot of the management processor to get into the ROM, you could argue that the boot failure code is now part of that boot and lost. And I think what Varun is arguing is that we should make sure that that is from the failed boot so that you can diagnose the problem of what happened.
But then is it reported as a boot failure code, or is it something else? Like,
it's a boot failure code of the boot that failed in this context. And I think we'd have to look at the three transitions to understand exactly what this is, right? And the way this is kind of written is that and we'd have to kind of change this a little bit as well, is that the intention here is that the boot failure code is only populated in this case. So the device has to have 0xe as the status in order to have the code. But I don't think that works in the case that you're talking about. We'd have to change this. But the point I think that's being made is you want the code from what failed, not from not the running recovery process is, I think, the point. And I agree with that. And I think we just need to fix this up a little bit to make sure that that's clear.
So if we look, oh, sorry, Elaine, go ahead.
So is there no other place to report? I mean, wouldn't there be other failures as well that would trigger recovery besides boot failure? I mean, it seems like what you're needing to solve here is to pass information beyond or across into recovery mode, but boot isn't going to be the only one.
I think it is the only one. Maybe I'm missing something. So the point of this register here is that if you start at the top of this, and again, sorry for moving around. We start at the top of this picture, right? We basically read the device status, which is the first byte. And if we're healthy, then it's great, unless we want to do a forced recovery. But if it's not healthy, that means one of two things happen. The device is either hung, in which case we want to go through a forced recovery, or the device has detected there's an issue and entered recovery, which is here. And I think what's being discussed is that in this case, you really want the boot code from the previous, from the boot that failed, not not in this recovery state. And I think that that's true, right? So so through this path, the boot failed for a reason that's enumerated in that code set. And we want to make sure that in this state, that recovery, that boot failure is retained such that you can say, okay, for some reason, the image that was pushed, it couldn't find an image with the correct key manifest in it, in this example, or whatever the other codes are.
So are
So
you
that
saying
would
that?
be entered recovery.
So are you saying that you could do, even if you performed an automatic recovery and you were successful, you still wanted to have the error that the original boot failed and I had to go, the automatic recovery
Right.
was executed and passed, but you still, so that you can let them know that, hey, there is a problem or was a problem.
Right. I mean, if you want to fully automate it, you may not care what it is, right? It's not healthy. I go through and I just pave it. Boom, done, over with. But it seems like, it might be interesting or it seems like it would be good practice to be able to get the boot failure code that got you into the state.
Well, in the case where the device was hung and you did a forced recovery, what would the boot state reflect in that case?
The boot state in that case would reflect, I'd have to go down and look. In this case, it's basically not valid, right? Because you forced it into recovery.
So just another sorry,
Yep.
just another perspective. Shouldn't we put the onus on the controller which is automating this process to keep track of the previous boot failure and take the action? The way it is currently written makes it kind of obvious to me that you need to report this failure code if the status is boot failure. So it's a healthy device, boot fails, and we report the failure code. And after that, how you automate it, how many times you want to recover it, that should be on the controller who is trying to automate this recovery process.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. The question is that per the spec right now, the device can enter recovery mode after this automatically without being commanded by the. So if you go through this piece, effectively what happens is that you lose this code is now not valid. Unless we add specific text that says, in this case, the failure code from the previous failure is valid. And you're right, there's two ways to get into recovery mode. One of which is forced, the other one is the device enters this by, for example, it can't find this key manifest as an example.
So is there a specific rule as to how and when that boot failure code gets cleared? I'm just thinking about getting confused if you reboot multiple times and the thing doesn't get cleared at the same time, you may be looking at irrelevant information.
So right now it's clear because I think it's very narrow, right? And right now the way it's written is that the thing failed to boot and the boot failure code is this. So if it's not E, then this is not valid per the way it's written right now. I think what's being requested is that if I boot into recovery mode and I had a boot failure, populate the code from the last piece. And I think that makes sense to me. And again, any other device healthy, any of these other cases, this boot code failure code is not valid. It's only valid in this case, and then if we add it, it would be in this case.
Eric, just so that I understand the fundamental, I think there was an argument, and most of us agreed, saying that we don't want the device to enter to recovery mode automatically, correct?
No, it can enter recovery mode automatically. Absolutely, that's part of the spec. Okay, it can't execute a recovery image. That was the piece that we didn't want to have automatically, right? So in this case, so in this case, the device booted.
Okay.
It could not find a valid image, and it entered recovery mode. Boom. And I think in this case, the point that's being made is that you lose the way this is written. You've lost that reason of why you got here. And I think we should add it so that in this case, the recovery mode, we would have this boot failure code. And I think that's
So
that's fine.
you would stay in device status as boot failure only if you don't support automatic recovery mode. I mean, I'm trying to understand when will you respond as boot failure versus recovery mode.
Okay,
Only if
so
you, yeah.
boot failure, you would end up at boot failure if you did not enter recovery mode. So basically, this is the case. You just boot and you're not there. So in this case, what you would do is you'd write down into the where is it? Sorry, again, I don't want to make people sick. You would then go into the, you would force the recovery and reset. And that would
Okay.
reset the device. But if the device is intelligent enough to say, yeah, I failed, I don't need to do another reset. I'm already in, I'm going to reset and go back and wait for you to push something down to me. That's this case right here. Or sorry, that's this case right here. We're in recovery mode and we're ready to either accept, the selection of the C image or ready to push the image down.
Okay.
And in this case, I think the boot failure code should be updated from effectively the failing boot is the way I would update this.
Okay. Is this just me and maybe do you think we should probably amend this with a state diagram?
I have that up. That's supposed to be this. So
yeah, that okay.
So I think what needs to happen is that in this case, okay, when you're in this recovery image load, the boot status would be populated from the previous boot. And I think the point is that if you were forced, it would be healthy. And if it was an error, it would have the boot status code. And I think was being requested. And I think that seems reasonable to me. It basically tells you how you entered this recovery image. Either the device entered it, by its own, or it was forced into here. And so I think that's reasonable.
Okay, I got it. So then I think the boot failure code reporting conflates to three more states: the recovery, recovery pending. Okay, got it.
Right. And I'll add some text around that. So does that seem reasonable to everyone? I'll update that, and then we can resolve this comment here.
The only thing that's bothering me is it seems so restrictive, and you have to know so much about it. It's maybe it's just a nomenclature thing that it's like recovery reason, and it's not always. It may not for the future always be boot failure. Right? It's like, why did you do this in the first place?
So there was a comment that I resolved by taking these error codes out of one of the other docs. Okay. So, and it was called boot failure. We can make it recovery. We could change. We could call it recovery failure codes. That's fine. I don't have an issue with that. But I think probably what needs to be in here, which isn't, is one where I don't have a failure code, as in it's not valid. So it is probably what needs to be here as well.
Yeah, I think recovery reason is a good suggestion. That makes it a lot clearer.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay.
Thanks.
That works. Excellent. Okay, so there was a comment in here and I think this is resolved. I just wanted to point out there forced recovery is not required, but you can enter it via these mechanisms. And I think this is resolved.
One note, Eric, I think you need to put the additional zeros there in the examples.
I think this is now 2 bytes. Because we moved the recovery activation here. So
Yeah.
this was 2 bytes. Okay, and then this one, yeah, okay, perfect.
Yeah, so this should be F02 and F00.
Yes, yep. Okay, I'll fix that. That's good. And then this is the activate that we talked about earlier.
I'm sorry if I missed it. Going back to the recovery codes, what will be reported if the recovery will fail? So you have two failure, like a boot failure and recovery failure.
So I'm not exactly sure I follow. So if we go back to here, right now, what we're going to do is change this to recovery failure codes. Okay. So if the device is in recovery mode, it will populate this with the reason for entering recovery, which will be this list. And we can talk about this. And I need to add 2 things. One is forced recovery, because that's not on this list, and that would be a reason to get into recovery. And then I think that's probably the big thing. Does that answer the question?
Well, you will go through those modes, like you're ready to accept recovery image and you do the recovery pending and stuff like in your diagram. But in general, at the end, your recovery will fail for whatever reason. What's going to happen in errors?
So I guess the case that would be is if you went through this path and this execution failed.
Right.
Okay. So in this case, you would update I think you'd update the image. You would update the recovery code based upon, let's say that you pushed down an image that had an anti-replay counter that was bad. Okay, so you try to reboot that and it would report that effectively this image is bad because of the anti-rollback counter, and then it could re-enter recovery mode with that error code, or it could sit there and wait to be commanded to that position.
So one of your error statuses should be recovery failed. Is that because it will go in circular, right? If your recovery will fail all the time, you're going to change the error codes, right, every time. So in general, you will lost the original reason for recovery, and then you will collect all the recovery errors.
Agreed. I would rather push that onto the controller, would be my thought. But I mean, we can discuss it obviously. So to me, you start this thing, the device for some reason can't find an image, it boots into recovery. All right, so now obviously the recovery agent knows this. It pushes down an image, activates it, and instead of coming back to a healthy state, it goes back to recovery mode with a code that said you push down a image with a bad replay counter. So I would like to keep that state transition in the controller and not into the device. So at this point, if it tries to activate this and it can't for any reason, it should basically do exactly what it does on boot and enter recovery mode. That would be my recommendation. Is that what's the thoughts? That makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Just failing to recover is the same as any other failed boot.
Right, exactly. And yeah, if the recovery agent doesn't, handle this right, you're going to just get in this loop, which, it's the device is doing what it's kind of, commanded to do, which I think is a good thing.
So right now you have two statuses, right? Your recovery agent status and the device status, like a boot failure status. So you have looks like two codes what you have to check.
Right, exactly.
Codes.
Yep. Okay. Yep. So I think that's the last one in here. So we got, yeah. Okay, so the other question, Ben, you pointed this out, is do we need some type of compliance section? Which I think we could put something together on that quickly. Is there an example that we might want to use for this? Because this could get crazy. But I mean, I could put together a quick table at, kind of IEEE style that said, must report all these pieces. I can put that together.
All right. Yeah, I don't have a specific example.
Okay.
There's one in the end of the attestation spec.
There is? Okay, I'll take a look at that, and I'll try to put something together for that.
It's just I grabbed all the things up in the text and copied them down to the bottom.
Yeah, exactly. I can put that together. That's not hard. All right, so I think that resolves all the issues other than a couple of the edits and updates. So Nate and others, do we want to do a final pass, or what do we want to, I can make these changes and then send out an email to the group that says the changes are in, any final comments, and then move forward. Is that what we want to do?
Okay, one last comment. Is it worth adding a flow diagram, or when you get to the recovery mode, what the host supposed to send in terms of the command sequence?
So that's what this diagram is supposed to do. It sounds like it doesn't. Does this need to be more detailed? I'm kind of a little concerned with making it more detailed because it'll be very difficult to read. But I could add some more detail as kind of flows in this. Would that work?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
If you can, I would keep this diagram as is and have like link to a detailed diagram elsewhere so that you don't like clutter up one diagram a lot.
What I did for my internal team, which is is I added kind of flow information, like, okay, so it goes through this, and then I added some detail in the text that, okay, through this diagram, so I can do that. And again, I don't want to make the diagram too complicated, or else it loses its value, in my opinion. Okay. All right, so we're at the end of the hour. So I can make these edits. I'll send it out as a final, and then Nate, you can, and others on the steering committee decide what we want to do next.
If we don't already have a roadmap, then an outline which includes at least I3C.
Yep, we should do that.
Yep, Yigal already added it to our roadmap for all the docs, eventually updating everything to I3C.
Okay.
We have a live backlog.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks a lot for everyone for working on this. It's good. I think we're in a good place. So I'm happy with it. So I will update this. I want to get this done. I'll do this in the next week, and I'll send out an email when I've got the updates complete.
Sounds good. Thanks, Eric.
All right. Thanks a bunch.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks.
Bye.